All right, it's 10:02. Let's go ahead and get started. This is Bonnie McFarland, and welcome to our December State and Federal Programs Directors Meeting. And yes, Hatha, we do have some questions. We'll get to you. So I saw your note in there. So good to see you virtually. Today, just so you know, if you happen to be new or if it's just been a long time since we've seen you, we do have the slides are posted and the link is in the chat to the slides. And we also have the previous presentations. We have both the slides and the audio presentation available, the recording. So those are available from previous presentations if you want, or previous meetings, if you want to take a look at those. And I think we haven't seen you for a while because we usually skip November. It's a busy month. So happy to get back. And I wish that we were giving you something beautiful tied up with a red bow, but unfortunately, we have a lot of topics that came up. Some of you, many of our topics for today came because of requests from some of you. You were looking for information on various new programs. And just a disclaimer right away, we did our best to find what we can. Information is dribbling out on some of these, but we know you folks need to get a head start on things. So we will be talking about several of those. One, I believe we have Miriam Shega from our school nutrition services with us, and she's going to give an update. Last month, we talked about some free and reduced lunch issues and making sure you were aware of that. We gave you kind of a high level overview, and Marian offered to come and provide a little more information, answer any questions today. So we'll hear from her in a few minutes. Then we had some requests to look at a couple things. One is the A3G Completion Improvement Grant. And we have some information on that, and that's one that is coming out a little bit slowly. Also the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, which that's also caused some confusion because we have two similarly named programs, a grant and a program. And so Rachel's going to walk you through that. We did want to just give you a reminder on the some federal requirements on your ed relief funds, because we know that generally ends up in your office. And Adrian will be giving us an FPM update. And then you will see a list of a whole lot of reminders. So these are going to be brief updates, but we're going to share a little bit. The ESSER 3 expenditure plan, we're in the process of reviewing those right now, and Jeannie's going to update you on that. Educator effectiveness grants, you're taking those to the board this month. So just wanted to give you some last minute updates. We will talk about the LCAP supplement, but only briefly because we're going to be doing a workshop next month, and Jeannie will share that with you. We'll address the LCAP submission, and then Title I, a couple things coming up, comparability, and also just a reminder on the Khan app. So that's a full agenda for today. So I'm going to, we look at the next slide. We're going to ask you to put questions in the chat. As I said, a lot of these are new topics, and we're going to have to dig to find information for you. Your questions always push our thinking and push CDE's thinking too. So please put your questions in the chat. And as usual, we send out a Q&A afterward with written responses to your questions. So please put those in the chat. We anticipate there'll be a lot of them this time. And let me see, what else do we have here? The next slide, we just, the Q&A, if you're new or if you missed other meetings, you can always get those Q&A documents from our previous meetings. They're on the webpage with the slides, with the recordings, and also the answers to your questions. So that's hopefully a little bit of everything before we get started. And I think, first of all, I'm going to turn it over to Miriam if she's here, and she's going to give us a bit of an update on school nutrition programs, and then answer any questions that might come up. Miriam?
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Bonnie, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much to Bonnie and the entire ASM team for giving me the opportunity to join you today. As Bonnie mentioned, my name is Mariam Shayed, and I serve as LACO's Nutrition and Wellness Coordinator. Our unit supports the expansion and implementation of the federally mandated school wellness policies. And really wanted to just let you know that we're here to support you in this area, and the local school wellness policies really are an untapped tool for addressing barriers that significantly affect the health and psychosocial determinants of attendance and learning. So if we can support you and your team in this area, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And I know you have a full agenda to cover, and Bonnie already provided a comprehensive overview about the meal program at your last meeting. So in the short time that I have with you today, I will provide a few updates and share some resources that I hope will be helpful to you. And please reach out to me after the meeting if you have any questions or need additional information. So with the next slide, I just wanted to provide a few updates. You're all aware that as a result of COVID-19, there have been some national waivers that were issued by the USDA, and this allows our school districts to operate the Seamless Summer Option Program, which provides free meals to students, to all students ages 18 and under. And what the SSO, the Seamless Summer Option, or SSO, allows meal program providers to do is that they have the option of operating open feeding sites. But the use of these available waivers are optional that allow LEAs to choose a meal program that best fits the needs of their school community. But most of our LEAs have opted into operating this program this year because it reduces a lot of administrative burden, and also they receive a higher meal reimbursement rate. So SSO is our universal meal program this year. But with AB 130, it established the California Universal Meal Program, and that is set to begin in school year 22-23, which has made changes to the state meal mandate, which requires public school districts, county offices of education, and charter schools to provide 2 nutritiously adequate meals free of charge during each school day to students who request a meal. And this is regardless of their free and reduced price meal eligibility. And the 3 components that I just wanted to highlight, the 3 components to the universal meal program, which are included on this slide, is the first one is that the California state meal mandate is expanded again to include both a breakfast and lunch meal for all children each school day. And LEAs will still be required to comply with the federal regulations and guidelines, as the California Universal Meal Program is meant to supplement the existing meal program, the federal school nutrition program, and it's not to supplant or replace the existing meal program. And the California Universal Meal Program requires very high poverty schools to participate in a federal provision, which I believe Bonnie covered at the last meeting. So by June 30th of this year, schools that have an identified student population of 40% or more, they will be required to apply for a federal universal meal provision, such as community eligibility or provision 1 or 2. And the intent of this is to maximize the federal reimbursement for the meal program. This is subject to budget appropriation, and the state will cover the difference between the free federal reimbursement rate and the reimbursement that's provided for the reduced price and the paid meals that now will be covered by the state funding. So again, the big point to emphasize here is that the Universal Meal Program does not replace the existing meal program. So with that, the next slide, we know there has been some concerns about now that school meals are offered to all students at no cost, what happens to the meal application? And the California Universal Meal Program will not eliminate the need for the meal application or alternative income form. The alternative income form, which I believe Bonnie also covered, this was developed for LCFF purposes, for meals being operated under a provision. The CDE has provided 5 different templates that allow you to choose which template would best fit the need of your school district. But if a school district is not operating a provision, they will be required to collect the meal applications. So before COVID, the meal applications were used to determine eligibility for for free and reduced price meals, but due to COVID, the USDA allowed LEAs that are operating the seamless summer option to collect and process school meal applications. But normally under this program, because it is activated during emergency situations, we don't collect meal applications, but because of LCFF, and now I'm sure you all know about the pandemic EBT program, LEAs can use the meal application or the alternative income form to determine eligibility. So if they choose so if you can see the drastic differences between the two different forms. So if they choose the meal applications, they have to comply with the federal rules, including verification activities and reporting. And another important consideration is that cafeteria funds can't be used to collect and process alternative income forms. So we know many of our districts who have staffing shortages, they may have limited capacity, they may want to continue to use the cafeteria funds and enlist the help of nutrition services staff to collect this important data. So LEAs that choose to use the alternative income form, they have more flexibility, as you can see. The alternative income forms are not subject to verification requirements, and LEAs have a little bit more flexibility on how they can collect this information. For example, there are during COVID, many of our support staff that were that were working from home, they were able to collect this information over the phone. So they, for example, the meal application requires a physical signature, but the alternative income forms that were used, that some districts started to use during COVID, they were able to have staff directly contact households and collect that required information without requiring a physical signature. So LEAs have been using one or the other, and there's no mandate that schools can't use both forms. Sometimes that helps to make sure that important information is collected. The CDE Nutrition Services Division is working with the LCFF office to update the guidance related to the meal applications and alternative income forms as they prepare for the launch of the Universal Meal Program. So families, knowing that meals are free this year, they may assume that applications are no longer required. And I think there's some confusion among district staff as well, district and school site staff as well. They know that all children are receiving meals for free. So why should they require the meal applications? I have included a link on this slide to a resource from the Food Research and Action Center that highlights some strategies and best practices for increasing meal application returns. And just a few strategies that I wanted to highlight for you is that, setting target free and reduced percentages based on historical data. Some districts have found this strategy to be helpful. LAUSD has shared that they found it beneficial to set goals for free and reduced meal percentages for the schools based on historical data. So an example they provided is if a school that had achieved a 65% free and reduced price rate through meal applications and direct certification the previous years, they would try to set a goal to achieve a higher percentage and try to get a better rate of completed applications. And conducting targeted outreach with a focus on students that had eligibility in the previous 2 years, and specifically, reaching out to those households and making sure that they submit their applications, and also tracking student eligibility by school on an ongoing basis. This is really critical to make sure that students' eligibility and are monitored and tracked on an ongoing basis, and running a report on a weekly basis, updating your student information systems daily to identify any newly qualified students, and making sure that that information is communicated with your nutrition services departments, and making sure that they have access to that data, and also coordinating with school administration to contact families to, again, provide that targeted outreach. Also, some districts have enlisted the help of retirees to help contact parents. This is a strategy that can be helpful for many of our school districts that are experiencing staffing shortages, and also considering, partnering with IT to maybe launch a social marketing campaign to educate, not just, families and students, but also district and school site staff about the importance of the meal application, that it's not just about qualifying for free meals, but also gaining access to many other programs. And one of those programs that I just wanted to highlight is the Pandemic EBT. Pandemic EBT is a federal food program that was authorized during COVID to provide additional food benefits for families. And we're talking about a significant amount of food benefits, and families are aware of this program. They're calling their school sites about it. And one of the factors to determine eligibility for Pandemic EBT is the free and reduced price meal eligibility. So again, families who are determined, or students who are determined to be eligible, if they receive all distance learning last year, they would receive up to $123 per month. So again, this is a lot of additional food benefits that can be so helpful to our families who are really struggling to make ends meet. So the online applications have been a very successful strategies in getting getting families to complete, one of the forms that the district, chooses. And some districts or school sites open their computer lab and again assist families with completing the application, the online application. With the direct certification numbers, that's always a very tested and proven way to identify students. It's really important to work closely with the CalPADS administrators and using both CalPADS data and also the local county data. Some of our districts have MOUs with local agencies such as the Department of Social Services to identify students who fit the categorical eligibility, as if they're receiving CalFresh benefits. That's a former food stamp program, and also working very closely with the homeless and migrant student liaison in your district to make sure that you're identifying the homeless and migrant students on an ongoing basis as well. So those are some strategies that may be helpful in increasing the rate of meal application returns. And on the next slide, I wanted to, on the next slide, I have included some resources for you in response to some questions and concerns that we have received regarding sharing of school meal eligibility data. The first link includes information about sharing data collected on school meal applications. We have an ed code that establishes that any information collected on a school meal application is considered to be confidential. And the ed code that we have here in California is more restrictive than the federal regulations with how application information may be shared. However, information can be made available on a need-to-know basis for authorized purposes, such as local control funding formula determinations, and to carry out supplemental educational services. So I suggest that you take a look at the FAQ tab on this link that I have provided for you. And there's a management bulletin that specifically covers sharing of school meal applications. So if there's any confusion about whether this the meal data information can be shared, I think this guidance will be very helpful in to clarify and provide some accurate information on that. And if you need additional information about the use of meal applications versus the alternative income form, there is CDE guidance on this. And please keep in mind that, as I mentioned earlier, that the state is in the process of updating the guidance as they prepare for the launch of the Universal Meal Program. So if you need additional ideas and tips for how to increase meal application submissions, I highly recommend taking a look at the No Kid Hungry toolkit that I've provided the list for you, the link for you on this slide for you to access with many additional resources and tools that you can take back and share with your teams. So, and I've also included my contact information. So if I can be of any help to you or your teams, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And I know I know there may be some questions, so I'll pause to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, Miriam, first of all, thank you, especially for providing those resources for encouraging families to submit the forms, because that was a question last time. But one of the questions we did get, and I'm wondering if that second link will do it, the sample alternative form on the CDE website, I thought it was on the LCFF page, but I don't see it. Is it at that second link? Is there a sample there?
I will actually include a separate link in the chat if it's okay.
Okay, very good. Yeah. And I'm not sure, there's only one other question. I'm not sure. We'll see if it makes sense to you. It says, how does paid lunch equity work with the universal meal program? I'm not sure. I'm not clear on what that is.
Yes, if the state is working on providing additional guidance on that. So I will be sure to provide any additional information on the paid lunch equity.
Okay, very good. Then we'll include that if you have anything in the follow-up. And then one other question, is there a way food can be provided to students during like winter break? Or is that a local decision? Yes?
It is a local decision. If they, if for the length of the break is less than 10 days, then the federal meal program won't be able to provide those meals to those students. So they really encourage to, use the general funds to provide meals to students. But if the winter break is 10 days or longer, then you will be able to use the SSO program to provide meals to those students.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's good to know
so
you're just down the hallway. We will pass any questions your way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll include some additional links in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great. Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Miriam. All right. All right. So put any questions and we will get back to Marian to assist us with any additional questions you have. So put them in the chat. But moving on now, this was one of our requested items. People are looking ahead at some of the legislation this summer and wondering what's going on with the A3G Completion Grant. And Debbie Kano was brave enough to step forward and look into that and has some information to share for you. Debbie?
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, Miriam. Okay, so as Bonnie said, we kind of just had to dive in and figure this out. There wasn't a lot of information, and there isn't still. What we have is coming from Ed Code 41590, and oh, next slide, please. Sorry. And so this just gives you that outline of what's going on here with this A2G grant. Just under 550 million was portioned for A2G Completion Improvement Grant Program. And what they've said is this is similar to the College Readiness Block Grant. And this is established to provide additional support to LEAs to increase the number of A2G eligible high school graduates, and in particular, our unduplicated students. Next slide, please. A2G Completion Improvement Grant Program comes in 3 different forms and 3 different grants. So they're allocated in these different, if you will, buckets. So their access, success, and learning loss mitigation. So each of these allocations have differing amounts, similar, slightly different criteria for qualifying, and their allowable uses. So the funds are specifically for secondary, of course, grades 9 to 12, and all the LEAs will receive, with those grade levels, will find that they will fall into either access or success, depending on their A2G graduation rate data. And then all districts will receive part of the learning loss mitigation. So next slide, please. We're going to take a look at this A2G access grant. So this is the grant with the largest amount of money, where 300 million was allocated to this, and LEAs identified as having an overall A2G completion rate of less than 67% will qualify for this grant. The per pupil allocation will be based on the LEA's number of unduplicated students in grade 9 to 12 for the 2021 fiscal year, as reported in the Fall 1 CalPATs. For All the LEAs that are currently receiving concentration grant money during 2021 fiscal year shall receive no less than $75,000. So if you're a district that has received concentration grant money for your through LCFF in the 2021 year, you will not receive less than $75,000 if you have a smaller school district. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the success grant differs in the amount that's allocated. This was allocated $100 million, and this will be allocated to schools, LEAs with an A to G completion rate of 67% or higher. So this grant is also going to be based on the number of unduplicated 9th to 12th graders for the 2021 fiscal year as reported in Fall 1 CalPATS. And like the Access Grant, the LEAs receiving concentration grants during 2021 fiscal year shall receive an allocation of no less than $75,000. Here, LEAs are encouraged to direct the funds for the A to G Success Grant to pupils in danger of not achieving a C or better in A to G courses. So that is the hope and the intent behind this Success Grant. Next slide, please. So the use of funds for Access and Success Grant. Here, these two grants must be used for activities that directly support pupil access to and successful completion of the A to G course requirements, including professional development opportunities for teachers, administrators, and counselors. So this is the allowable uses of professional PD for teachers, administrators, and counselors to improve the A to G completion rate, developing comprehensive advising plans and pupil support, including tutoring programs, expanding access to coursework to satisfy A to G course requirements to all students, not just limited to unduplicated students. And then also for AP and IB fees for unduplicated students. So these funds can be used in these different ways. Next slide, please. So now that third one, that learning loss mitigation grant. And again, this will be for all districts who have 9th to 12th grade. So $147,513,000, $147,513,000, there you go. Learning loss mitigation money was allocated here. And these funds, like the others, will be allocated on the number of unduplicated students in that 2021 fall submission. And that is incorrect. I apologize. And I knew that was incorrect before I did it. But I left it in. My apologies. So about that 67% or higher, that does not, this is for all districts. And like the other two grants, the LEA receiving a concentration grant would also receive no less than $75,000. And the funds are going to be available to use until to expand or encumbered to the year 25-26. Okay, next slide. So the learning loss mitigation grant. So the use of these funds are going to be, the first use was to allow students who received a D or F or a fail grade in A to G courses in the spring semester of 2020 or in the 2021 school year to retake those courses. And if there are funds remaining, an LEA may use them to offer credit recovery opportunities to all students to ensure they are able to graduate high school on time. So these funds are a little different than the other two. And moving on, next slide. So the plan requirements. Okay, so an LEA must develop a plan by April 1, 2022. Initially, that was January 1, 2022, and it was pushed back to April because the allocations were not ready. They still are not out yet. So if you're asking how much are you getting, we don't know yet. That has not been published. Okay, so the plan must explain how the funds will increase or improve services for unduplicated students to improve A to G eligibility. Districts will need to explain in their plan how the funds will be used to supplement, not supplant, services identified in LEA's LCAP and Learning Recovery Plan. The plan will also need to describe how all students, especially unduplicated pupils, will have access to A to G courses. The plan will need to be discussed at a regularly scheduled board meeting and then adopted at a subsequent regularly scheduled meeting. So those two things are key. We want a backward plan before April 1st and look at your already scheduled board meetings, because you're going to need to use 2 of those board meetings to, 1, present it, and then 2 to a separate one to adopt it. And then allocations, I've already said this about allocations are currently not available. As soon as we get those allocations, we hear that they're published, we will ensure that we get that information to you. And we do not have the template either for this plan. Next slide, please. Okay, so the reporting requirements. This would be that the grant recipients must report to the State Superintendent of Public Instruction on or before December 31st, 2023, on how they are measuring the impact of the funds for their A to G completion rate. The grant recipient shall also report to the superintendent on or before August 31st, 2026, on final outcomes that measure the impact of the funds received under this section. CDE will publish on their website information and a list of LEA's completion rates throughout the grant, and at the end with the outcomes of the A to G completion rates for the districts receiving the grant money. And that'll do it. I'm going to hand it over to Rachel.
Thank you, Debbie. Good morning, everyone. So in this section, we're going to be taking a look at the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program requirements. Next slide, please. So first, we just wanted to start off by clarifying that the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, also known as the ELOP, and the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant, known as the ELOG, are 2 different things. And we know that there might be some confusion between the 2, especially since their names are pretty much the same. So the ELO program is a result of Assembly Bill 130, and it provides $1.75 billion in state funds for after-school and summer school enrichment programs for transitional kindergarten through 6th grade. And this is ongoing funding, and the intent is to increase the funding amount in future years through the budget process. So for the ELO program, a program plan is required. However, a deadline for this plan is not specified in statute. And requirements for the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program can be found in Education Code 46120. Now, the ELO grant, on the other hand, was a result of Assembly Bill 86, which was signed in the spring of 2021. And the ELO grants provide $4.6 billion in one-time funding to LEAs to implement a learning recovery program that provides supplemental instruction and support for social and emotional well-being. One important thing to note is that ELO grant funds include both state and federal funds with different expenditure deadlines depending on the specific resource code. And as you may recall, the ELO grant plan was required to be adopted by the LEA's local governing board this past June. And requirements for the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant can be found in Education Code 43522. One additional thing that I'd like to note regarding the ELO grant is that an email went out yesterday from CDE stating that the federal assurances for the ELO grant are now available on the CDE's website. And we've included the link on this slide. The ELOG assurances must be completed by LEAs as a condition of receiving federal ELOG funding for resource codes 3216, 3217, 3218, and 3219. And LEAs that submit the required assurances by January 18th, 2022 will be included in the first apportionment of federal ELO grant funds, which will reflect 25% of the federal allocations. So hopefully those charts just clarify the differences between these two things. So one is the ELO program and the other is the ELO grant. And for the rest of this presentation, we'll focus on the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, or the ELOP. Next slide, please. So the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program provides funding for after-school and summer school enrichment programs for transitional kindergarten through 6th grade. And the statute defines expanded learning as before school, after school, summer, or intersession learning programs that focus on developing the academic, social, emotional, and physical needs and interest of pupils through hands-on engaging learning experiences. It's intended that these programs are pupil-centered, results-driven, include community partners, and complement but not replicate the learning activities in the regular school day. So expanded learning opportunities does not mean an extension of instructional time, but rather opportunities to engage pupils in enrichment, play, nutrition, and other developmentally appropriate activities. Next slide, please. So here is just a bit of background information on the ELO program. So as mentioned, it was a result of AB 130, and it was later amended by AB 167. As a result of AB 167, LEAs are permitted to use 2021-22 as a planning year and are not required to implement the ELO program until 2022-23. Additionally, 2021-22 funds may be carried over to 2022-23. So essentially, LEAs may use the 2021-22 school year to develop their ELO program or to implement the required ELO program in accordance with the program requirements that are specified in Education Code 46120. So that means if implementing the ELO program for the 21-22 school year, LEAs must offer expanded learning opportunities programming to all unduplicated students, TK through 6th grade, and are required to enroll 50% of unduplicated students TK through 6th grade. In terms of funding, school districts and charter schools with an unduplicated pupil percentage equal to or greater than 80% will receive an amount of $1,170 per classroom-based TK through grade 6 prior year ADA multiplied by the LEA's UPP. The remaining funds will be provided on a per unit basis for all other schools and charter schools using classroom-based TK through grade 6 prior year ADA multiplied by the LEA's UPP. Next slide, please. So in terms of eligibility for expanded learning opportunities programs, school districts and charter schools with grades TK through grade 6 are eligible for funding. County offices of education and charter schools established pursuant to a petition submitted to the County Board of Education, as noted in Education Code 47605.5, are not eligible for funding. Preliminary entitlements have been posted and can be found on the CDE webpage at the link provided on the slide. Next slide, please. So this slide just highlights some of the key requirements that are specified in statute for the ELO program. So first off, LEAs must provide in-person before and or after-school expanded learning opportunities that, when added to instructional minutes, are at least 9 hours. And this includes providing 9 hours during intersession days. So basically, all hours a student is at school counts towards that total 9 hours requirement. LEAs must provide programming on all school days and at least 30 intersession days. Now, LEAs may provide a before school component, an after school component, or both before and after school components. And this may be on one or multiple sites within the LEA. Another requirement is that LEAs are required to prioritize programs at school sites in the lowest income communities, while also maximizing the number of schools and neighborhoods with programs. And beginning in the 2022-23 school year, LEAs must offer access to expanded learning programs to all K-6 students enrolled in classroom-based instructional programs. Next slide, please. So the ELO program requirements include many elements of the After-School Education and Safety Program, or the ACES program. And this includes the requirement to provide educational literacy and enrichment content, as well as nutritious snacks and/or meals. Additionally, the ELO program plan requires the inclusion of educational and enrichment elements, staff training, integration with the school day and other expanded learning opportunities, community collaboration, physical activity, fiscal accountability, and also data collection to support quality improvement processes. Program plans must also be reviewed every 3 years, including program goals, program content, and outcome measures. And so the intent is for ACES, 21st Century Community Learning Centers, and the ELO programs to be one unified coordinated program. Next slide, please. So as previously mentioned, LEAs are required to develop a plan for the ELO program. And the CDE has created a program plan template guide that LEAs are required to use. And here we've included a few screenshots of the first few pages of the plan template guide, as well as a link to this document. So this program plan needs to be approved by the LEA's local governing board in a public meeting and posted on the LEA's website. And as previously noted, statute allows LEAs to use 2021-22 as a planning year. But statute does not specify a deadline for the plan. So this program plan template guide is considered a living document and should therefore be reviewed periodically and adjusted to reflect the needs of the community and updates in the law, as well as to provide continuous improvement in the development of an effective expanded learning opportunities program. The LEA is responsible for creating, reviewing, and updating the program plan every 3 years. However, it's recommended that the plan be reviewed annually. Additionally, LEAs are encouraged to work collaboratively with staff as well as partners in the development and the review of the plan. Next slide, please. The CDE has posted some frequently asked questions related to the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, and you can see we've included a screenshot of those questions on this slide. Currently, there's only 5 questions posted. However, it's indicated on the webpage that additional FAQs will be added soon. Next slide. So lastly, here is a link to the CDE Expanded Learning Opportunities Program webpage. And on this webpage, you will find the links to the resources that we've shared, such as the funding results, the program plan guide, as well as the frequently asked questions. A link to the audit guide will also be included on this page once it's available. And it's important to note that the ELO program funds are subject to the annual audit. However, it's our understanding that it will not be included in the audit for 2021-22, since LEAs may use this year as a planning year and are not required to fully implement the program until 2022-23. And that concludes my section. So I will now turn it over to Bonnie.
Thanks, Rachel. And as we anticipated, a lot of questions in the chat. And so those 5 questions on the CDE website will definitely expand based on this, but we will address them. We did notice the inconsistency that you addressed regarding charter schools, and we will get clarification on that one. So thank you for your questions. We will get those back out to you in the Q&A. All right, we just wanted to touch on a few of the federal requirements for Ed Relief funds. We know you're getting a lot of funding right now, and right now you're in the process of developing plans and determining what you're going to do with those funds. But we know that with federal funds always comes federal accountability and federal requirements, and that tends to end up in your office, which is why you have a busy office. So we just wanted to clarify a few of the requirements so that you aren't hit from behind or surprised by some of those. And so you're prepared for them. So let's just take a look at a few of those. And some of these will be repeats because I know that Adrian has gone over some of the compliance requirements a couple times in the last few months, but we just want to touch on a few of them. So next slide, we'll take a look at just federal program requirements. And all federal education programs are subject to several layers of requirements. They're subject to the requirements of the individual programs, and then they're also subject to something that many of you are familiar with, and that's the Uniform Grants Guidance. That applies to all federal education programs. So they have, in addition to that, they have individual program requirements. Now, most districts and most charter schools are most familiar with the Every Student Succeeds Act funds, and those are the ones that you commonly receive. And those are subject to the Uniform Grants Guidance, the Education Department Administrative Regulations, which are really an addendum to the Uniform Grants Guidance, and then the individual program requirements. And most of you know those very well. That's the requirements for Title I, II, III, IV, 5, McKinney-Vento funds, whatever they are, they have specific requirements in addition to these broad requirements. So that's typically what we work with, are those programs. And they're monitored through several processes. Of course, there's the state federal program monitoring, FPM process. Then there's also the single audit process. And the single audit process is required for any LEAs receiving $750,000 or more total in federal funds. So that's not by program, that's your total funding. The reason this is important now is that for many LEAs that received under the $750,000 previously and were not subject to the audit, now with all the addition of the federal ESSER 3 funds, all the Federal CARES Act, all the money that's been coming into your LEAs, that goes into that pot to make that $750,000 threshold. So many LEAs that previously were not subject to the single audit process are now subject to that process. So be aware, when you have your regular state audit, there may be an additional audit, which is for federal requirements under the Single Audit Act. Then the last spot in the road is the Office of Inspector General. And the Office of Inspector General investigates LEAs for any federal program violations, for waste, fraud, and abuse. So if you get a call from the Office of Inspector General, usually it's not good news because they usually have a clue that there's a problem, and that's why they come in, as opposed to FPM that generally comes in to review, not necessarily based on any particular issue going on. Okay, so that's what we typically have. So now let's at the next slide. Let's look at Ed Relief Funds and how are they different. These are not allocated through the Every Student Succeeds Act. They're allocated through 3 separate federal apportionments. So there's the CARES Act, which was back in March 2020. Those funds were released under that particular congressional act, and that was ESSER and GEAR, and that was what they called ESSER 1 and GEAR 1. They had their own requirements, and some of those requirements differ from what occurred in the other 2 funding bills. So then we had the CRRSA, the Coronavirus Response Relief Supplemental Appropriation Act in 2021, and that's what's referred to as ESSER 2 and GEAR 2. One of the changes here was the equitable services requirement was removed under CRRSA. It was included in CARES. So you can see they're a little different. Then the final one, which is the one you're looking at now, which are ESSER 3, is the American Rescue Plan. That was last March. So these are the 3 separate allocations, and they came through 3 separate congressional acts. So these funds are governed by the requirements of each of the acts. So CARES has its own list, CRRSA and the American Rescue Plan, they all have a list of allowable costs. Many of them cross over. They're very similar because the focus of them is similar, but there are differences you need to be aware of. All of these programs are also subject to the Uniform Grants Guidance. So all the things that you typically are used to under the Uniform Grants Guidance do apply to these funds too. And then the state, in some cases, added additional requirements. And you might recall way back under CARES, we had those GEAR funds, and the GEAR funds had a separate requirement called learning loss mitigation. That was a state imposed requirement. So sometimes the state adds requirements. So these are all what governs those funding sources. And then monitoring, these funds are also subject to monitoring through the FPM process. And there's a separate instrument which Adrian has shared with you in the past, the Federal Stimulus Monitoring Instrument. And it's worth taking a look at because although these funds have been available for some time, they can still be under audit because you're still spending some of those funds. Again, the single audit applies. So your auditor, in addition to your state audit, if you get $750,000 in all your federal funds, Every Student Succeeds, and the relief funds, if you exceed $750,000, in addition to your state audit, will be an additional audit. And that federal audit, essentially, there's a list of focus areas that the U.S. Department of Education comes up with, and they ask auditors to focus on those areas. And often the single audit changes annually based on problems they see in the field. So if any of our neighbors in other states across the country are doing things that are problematic, you'll see those things show up in the audit guide. So it changes from year to year. And then, of course, the Office of Inspector General also can investigate for waste, fraud, or abuse in these programs. And you can see the potential for waste, fraud, and abuse because it's a lot of money going out and there's a lot of flexibility, but there are some rules, and that's how things happen in other places throughout the country, not here, okay? But they trickle down and affect us, and that's what people start looking more closely. All right, so let's take a look at the Uniform Grants Guidance. Just want to just mention a few things that are in the guidance that are not new to you, but that apply to these programs. The first is the cost principles. This is in 200.430, I believe, are the cost principles for all federal programs. And this is the basis of them. It looks very simple, but if you look, there's a lot underneath that all costs have to be reasonable, necessary, and properly documented. Reasonable has to do with the cost. Is the cost reasonable? You're paying an exorbitant price. Just because you have a lot of money in federal funds doesn't mean you can buy the most expensive whiz-bang item. You have to show that it's a reasonable cost. It's what a reasonable person would pay for if you were paying for it out of your own pocket. Is it necessary to carry out the award? Do you really need this? Or is it nice to have, but it's not really applicable to the award? And we'll take a look at what that means a little bit later. The other is time distribution records. And time distribution, if you're paying someone out of any of these funds, it's federal funds, and you know they want to know what's happening with the money. So time and effort reporting is required. Now that may look different than what your typical time and effort reporting, because the use of these funds is very broad as compared to, say, Title I, Title III, which is a very focused program. And so you're going to need more tighter documentation. But whatever your documentation is, it needs to be consistent with your policies and procedures, because that's what you'll find in the Uniform Grants Guidance. It says you have to have policies and procedures in place to document the hours worked, that you have to show that there are internal controls. How do you make sure people are doing what they're supposed to be doing? And how do you make sure the funds are actually going for the right costs? What kind of training do people receive in order to, this is what your job is going to be? What's reconciliation? That means if something is charged and somebody works different hours throughout the year, then you have to back out that and apply it to the appropriate grant. So all of that needs to be in your policies and procedures, and you might want to look at them because they were probably developed for Every Student Succeeds kind of programs, or maybe way back under NCLB, and they might not allow for the kind of flexibility you might be able to work under for programs like this that have a broader use, classroom teachers and such. You usually don't have that for Title I. So what would that documentation look like? Also, you need prior written approval. Most of you know that because some of you have already applied, but if not, if you're thinking of a large capital outlay item over $5,000, that needs to go to CDE for approval before you can spend those funds. And then policies and procedures need to be in place for all of these. And again, you probably have them, but you might want to take a look at them and see if they're applicable to your ed relief funds. For example, allowability. Who's determining if something's allowable? You look, some of the grants have, ESSER 3 has some allowable costs. There's a list of them. Well, who checks that? How does that happen? What's your process? That's what an auditor will ask you. They're going to say, show me your allowability procedures and who said this was allowable and how did they make that decision? That all should be written down. Equipment purchase with these funds has to be on your inventory, and it has to be monitored just like any other federal funds. Procurement procedures. If you're purchasing something, you have to follow the appropriate procedures to make sure if it goes to bid, that there are bid procedures. Those have to be in place and followed. And again, all the other conflict of interest documenting, you still have to have documentation, invoices and such will be asked for during FPM. So those are some of the things that are in the Uniform Grants Guidance that would apply to those programs. Now, CDE has taken some of those, and on the next slide, we'll take a look at what they've done. They have developed a federal stimulus monitoring instrument. The Fiscal Monitoring Office is the team that's reviewing these funds. So we have your general FM Fiscal Monitoring Instrument. In addition, we have the Federal Stimulus Monitoring Instrument. If you hadn't looked at it, it's a good idea to look at it and see what's in there and what they're going to be reviewing. This applies to all three of those funding sources that we talked about. And these are all the areas, and this is what Adrian's gone over a couple times, I know, that includes review of all of these areas. So these are all the areas listed in the document that they're going to use for review. And they'll tell you what they're looking for, what they're looking at, and what kind of documentation you need. All right, next we'll look at the monitoring, and this is just some of the things again from that document. They're going to review receipts or documentation to substantiate how purchases are reasonable and necessary. And we talked about necessary to implement the program. And here necessary is, this is from the instrument, necessary to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID. And we're going to take a look at later the district's responsibility on that. But these funds have to do, that's why they were allocated. That's what Congress said, we're sending money out because schools need these funds to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID. So it's important that all LEAs are able to document that. And we see some things in some of the plans and we wonder, are they in response to COVID? Are they preventing, preparing for, responding to it? But that's up to you to be able to describe and address when you're audited. Budget reports, employees paid and whole duty statements, what are people doing? Your safe in-person return to in-person instruction plan, they will check to see that that's been updated within 6 months of receiving your ESSER 3 allocation, and that should also be posted. And then documentation that all expenditures addressing learning loss, and these are specific to ESSER 3, are evidence-based. So if you were involved in writing your ESSER 3 plan, you'd note that there was a section that required you to identify the actions that are addressing learning loss, and you had to put at least 20% of your funds in that section. If you look at the instrument, from the instrument, it appears that what will happen in a program review is that they will take any item, any activity in that section and require you to demonstrate how it's evidence-based. Now, when we review those plans, sometimes it's hard to tell, is that evidence-based or not? Because the description is rather vague and short, but and you only have to put 20%. And a lot of you put more than 20% in there, and that's fine. Nobody says you can't, but they all have to be evidence-based if you're putting them in that section of your plan. So you might hear from some of us questioning some of those activities. All right, next slide is allowability of costs. Procedures, and we talked about, do you have policies and procedures for determining if a cost is allowable? So again, we said that needs to be based on the authorizing statute. So what does the law say and who's checking that? That it has to be in response to COVID. So that's another allowability factor, is it? Any additional state requirements, like we mentioned, the old GEAR funds, you had to address learning loss mitigation. That was a state requirement. Allowable activities are identified for each program. That ESSER 3, the 20%, we mentioned that, the evidence-based activities. And then the last section is what CDE told us about this in response to COVID. This is from CDE Ed Relief Office. They said all stimulus funds must have a clear connection to preventing, preparing for, or responding to COVID-19. If they do not, then that expenditure is not allowable. It's up to the LEA to determine and maintain documentation to show how an expense meets both the allowable use categories as well as it is preventing, preparing, or responding to COVID-19. Okay. So really important that you have that backup and that you can respond to that for all of your activities to avoid repayment of funds. All right. Now let's take a look at one reminder, okay, something you have forgotten, but back under the CARES Act, you might recall there was an equitable services requirement. It was only under CARES Act. After that, it was moved to the state, and now the state's responsible for equitable services. But the funds you received under the CARES Act, you had to reserve funds for equitable services for your private schools. And if you didn't spend those funds in that first year, then you have to make sure you have documentation that all the funds that were reserved out of that CARES Act were expended for that purpose. And that will be in the compliance document and will be checked during compliance monitor. All right, next we'll take a look at something new under the American Recovery Act. And that has to do with something called maintenance of equity. Well, different from what we typically know, maintenance of effort, there's an additional requirement. There's a maintenance of effort requirement, but also a maintenance of equity requirement. And this does apply at both the state and the LEA level. And it applies to 21-22 and 22-23 school years. So for those school years at the LEA level, LEAs can't reduce per pupil funding for any high poverty school by an amount that exceeds the total reduction, if any, so why there, of combined state and local per pupil funding for all schools in the LEA. So in other words, you can't reduce your high poverty schools more than you reduce other schools. If you have a reduction in funding, you can't put it more on the backs of your high poverty schools. You can't reduce them anymore. You also cannot reduce the number of FTE staff in a high poverty school by an amount that exceeds the total reduction, if any, of FTE staff per pupil in the LEA. So if you have a reduction in staff, it has to be equitable, and you can't have a higher number, a greater reduction in your high poverty schools. Next slide is also on that. So the question is, what's a high poverty school and how do you identify it? High poverty school, according to the guidance, is based on the data you use for your economically disadvantaged subgroup. So the data that you're using, generally that's free and reduced lunch, which we talked about, but how you're identifying those students in that student group, that's the same process you would use. And then you can use, sounds very much like ranking. For Title I, you can rank your schools from highest to lowest by the percentage of educationally, economically disadvantaged youth. And then once you've done that, you divide by 4 and you're going to identify your highest quartile. And that's going to be your highest poverty schools. If you do a grade span, you can do a grade span ranking. And there's a lot of information in the guidance, which is referenced down at the bottom, that shows you how to identify your highest poverty schools in rank order if you use a grade span. There is an annual reporting requirement for all of this, but there's been no information coming from the U.S. Department to the state, and therefore the state hasn't provided any guidance on what that reporting would look like. I wouldn't be surprised if something came into the CONAP, but we haven't heard any rumors to that effect. So, but I anticipate somewhere along the line, it is supposed to be a condition of receiving funds, but we haven't heard as to how that documentation will take place. So stay tuned for that one. So the last question is, what's the difference between maintenance of equity, which is on the next slide, and maintenance of effort, which you're familiar with? Whoops, did I skip a slide there? Oh, I did. You can go back. Skipped it because it's probably of less interest to you, but still important. Maintenance of equity also applies to at the state level. And so the state for this year and next, the state also can't reduce your per pupil funding amount for any high need, which is what, again, they call high poverty school. And by an amount that it exceeds the overall reduction. So if there were a reduction, we're not in that place right now, but if there were a reduction in state funding, they can't reduce a high poverty LEA more than other districts in the state or other LEAs in the state. All right, so now the next one, the last one, is about these two MOEs, MOE equity and our typical maintenance of effort. And how are they different? Because you always know that LEAs have to maintain fiscal effort, or you'll have your ESSA funding reduced. Well, the ESSER 3, the American Rescue Plan, also has a maintenance of effort, but in addition, it has this maintenance of equity. And they point out that both requirements are intended to ensure that both states and LEAs don't use these ARP funds to reduce state and local financial support for education, because that would have the effect of mitigating or eliminating the whole purpose of the ARP ESSER program. And that's to provide extra supplemental funding needed to keep teaching and learning going after the pandemic, to safely open schools, keep operations and in-person instruction going, support lost instructional time, emotional, social, mental health, and academic needs. All those things, what the funds, that's what they were to do. They were to support that, not to replace your funds. And we're seeing a lot of money moving around, and that's not the purpose. You have to maintain your effort. This should go on top of that to do the things you need to do to provide the kind of support your students need. The difference is that the maintenance of effort typical in the law ensure that the state maintains overall support for all their elementary and secondary schools and higher ed. So there's a basic requirement that the state can't reduce funding to districts and other LEAs, districts and charter schools. You can't reduce it and then put the American Rescue Plan funds instead. They have to maintain that support. The equity, the maintenance of effort equity requirements ensure that if there are reductions, if they're necessary at the state or at the local level, that they don't disproportionately reduce per pupil funding for LEAs and for schools that are serving low-income families. So an additional piece. And I know that that kind of brings something up for those of you that are working in those with those high poverty schools, a lot of money coming for them. You have those were your Title I schools. Now you have these requirements in addition and some additional funds there. So it behooves you to look at how do we do creative and exciting things to help our students in those schools. Right. So that's a little bit just to put in the back of your head for when you start seeing those. I know nobody worries about FPM until it comes, but you want to be prepared. So I will now turn it over to Adrienne.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Today in the FPM update, we're going to take a look at how to operationalize your federal program monitoring so that it can be a manageable process. Just before we move on to that, I just wanted a reminder that CDE provided an FPM training this past Monday and Tuesday, and they will be continuing to provide part 2 of this mid-year virtual training in January. On January 6, 2022, they will be presenting the other programs that weren't covered this past week. And at the bottom is the link. So even if you're not being FPM'd, I really highly encourage you to go to this the box and look at everything because it has the latest and greatest information available. So let's get started. So as you know, when you submit your consolidated application, you are also committing to ensuring that all the signed assurances, which are part of the federal program and funding, will be followed. And this is where your work begins. So my question to you is, are you grounded in what the assurances are about? Do you know what they all are and for each program? So as it's organized on CDE's website, you see general assurances that applies to the federal programs, but then you also have specific program assurances unique to each of those specified programs here on this webpage. And so remember that here you can find all of these links that are provided for you. So the federal programs has a timeline, and planning your federal program should be taking place before or at the beginning of the school year. And that the planning is the process of setting the course or the path for that upcoming year that your district or your school will be following. And then during the school year, this is the time where everyone is to be implementing the identified activities that you had planned. And so then once the implementation is underway, there needs to be monitoring that takes place. And this monitoring should be taking place at the district level as well as the site level in order to determine the effectiveness of your activities and program. And this evaluation is part of your process that happens towards the end of the school year or at the end of an intervention cycle if you have interventions that are throughout the year. And this information is necessary in determining what will happen for the next school year. And as always, a reminder for not only you, but for everyone at your LEA, is that you want to ensure that everyone knows that this is about kids and this is about the federal program. It's a program and that it should not be seen as a pot of money. And again, we can't emphasize that enough, you know, and again, we sometimes get questions of, you know, a principal wants to know, can I spend it on this? Well, you know, what did your comprehensive needs assessment say? What does their plan say? And so forth. So again, making sure that everyone understands is key and critical. So where do you start? Well, how do you operationalize all these federal requirements? So we recommend you start with the assurances, making sure you know what's required, and then look at the instrument. What does the instrument say? And you must know what evidence is being required to collect. Not just if you're selected for an FPM, but as part of your process ongoing year to year. It's something that is just, it's not dependent on a person. It's dependent on just, this is the way we do things with our federal programs. And so every year also, some of these instruments are revised. And so are you aware of all the changes each year that the instrument of the program that you're participating in? And also, who is that person at your site that is in charge of assuring that there is someone has looked at and compared last year's instrument to the current one? So what is your process for informing everyone involved with the federal programs? So you want to train everyone on what evidence is being asked. So for example, if you take a look at the compensatory education instrument, and we specifically look at CE5, it's the school site council composition. And this one was the #1 item found out of compliance, which I find so fascinating. And I always ask myself why. So let's look at the evidence that's being requested. And you can see that it's asking for the records of school site council peer selection, school site council roster with membership categories, and the school plan for student achievement. So that's what's being requested. So I want to share with you again the importance of the box. So what's a really great tool that's in the box is this Excel spreadsheet that's entitled the FPM 2122 evidence request. And what it is it has all of the required evidence in one place. Each sheet has the required items for document evidence collected for each of the programs. Unfortunately, though, it was created in August and it has not been updated, so it does not include the federal stimulus monitoring instrument, as Bonnie went over. So that's something that maybe you could add to this page, because it is an Excel spreadsheet that you can edit. But you definitely want to use this because it's kind of your one-stop shop here. So if you take a look at CDE's tool, you can create your own checklist from this. And I wanna give a shout out to Compton Unified School District, who we adapted this from. And this checklist is a great way to keep track of who's responsible for each item and what items have been collected or still need to be collected. And this is not just during an FPM, but this should be part of your process in a timely manner. Perhaps you can collect all of the planning documents towards, the fall, and then your monitoring documentation you can collect during the mid-year. And then at the end of the year, you have your review and evaluation of effectiveness of programs. So when you take a look at all the items being requested in the FPM instrument, you will see how it's kind of categorized in various stages of your timeline. So again, you want to personalize it to the school sites, to the program, to the district, and also to people, which staff members, which department are responsible for which programs, and how is that systematized. And if everyone knows the process, then everyone just simply has to follow it. And so again, we just wanted to share what's been successful in other districts. And so remember, as we're ending the calendar year, remember we're not ending the school year. We're right in the middle of our school year timeline. So again, at this point, who's monitoring the implementation of your federal programs? Now is a great time of reflection of what's what we planned. Has it been implemented? Are there barriers? Are there, do we need to make some modifications? And so again, it's a living, process. And so because our kids are living and they're going, and life is so, we have to be flexible these days. So again, I wanted to wish everyone happy holidays. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jeannie, who will share with you some important reminders.
Thank you, Adrian, and good morning, everyone. I have a few reminders and updates, and then Bonnie will finish it off with some additional reminders and updates. The first reminder is on the next slide, and this is about your educator effectiveness funds plan. And so, as you know, as a condition of receiving the educator effectiveness funds, on or before December 30th, that's this month, LEAs must develop and adopt their plan for their use of the educator effectiveness funds. And key to this requirement is that the plan must be, one, explained in a public meeting of the governing board, and this must occur before the plan is adopted in a subsequent public meeting. So this requires 2 separate board meetings. The deadline for this is December 30th. In the case that scheduled board meetings won't work, perhaps an LEA has only 1 board meeting scheduled for the month, the LEA may want to consider holding a special board meeting to meet this essential deadline. This deadline is essential, especially based on CDE communication indicating that an audit finding and repayment of funds may result in not having these 2 meetings. And this is because these 2 meetings are one of the conditions of apportionment for the educator effectiveness funds, which may be expended during the fiscal years 21-22 and ending with 2025 through 26. So that's reminder 1. Next slide, please. Reminder 2 is about the new requirement per AB 130, section 124. LEAs are required to present an update on the annual update to the 2021-22 LCAP and budget overview for parents at a regularly scheduled meeting of the governing board or body on or before February 28th, 2022. Briefly, this update needs to include the LEA's response to the new supplement template, which requires LEAs to provide descriptions for how the LEA engaged their educational partners on the use of funds that were not included in the 21-22 LCAP. These are funds, multiple funds that were provided to LEAs following the adoption of their LCAPs through the California Budget Act, the Federal American Rescue Plan Act, and other state and federal relief acts that, as you know, have provided significant increases in funding to support students, teachers, staff, and communities in recovering from the impacts of COVID-19 and the impacts of distance learning. So this is all included in the LEA describes this use of funds in the supplement. So this coming Wednesday, we will provide training for school district and charter school administrators responsible for the LCAP and the one-time supplement. And this training will address the supplement template sections, as well as requirements that are not specifically addressed in the template that must be included in the presentation to the governing board. And these requirements are included on the slide. In addition to what's in the supplement template, the LEA is providing a presentation about mid-year outcome data related to metrics and mid-year expenditure and implementation data on actions identified in their LCAP. So on the slide is the link to the supplement template and a link to register for the training. And we hope to see you this coming Wednesday. Next slide, please. This slide is an update, And our office and the charter school office have been reviewing ESSER 3 plans, and we will be following up through email and phone calls on our reviews of the LEA's ESSER 3 plans. And from the reviews of districts and charter plans, we have found that there are some areas where revisions are needed for approval of the plan. And this slide highlights some of the areas noted across LEAs that need revision. And some of these include meaningful engagement with all required stakeholders, including tribes and civil rights organizations. In some of the descriptions, we were not able to find all of the required stakeholders or information addressing tribes and civil rights organizations. In the actions descriptions, in some of the descriptions, it wasn't clear how allowable uses of ESSER 3 funds were, how the action was describing something that was an allowable use of the ESSER 3 funds. And in some of the plans, it wasn't clear that the LEA included at least 20% of their expenditures for addressing the impact of lost instructional time through evidence-based interventions. Additionally, in some of the action descriptions that referenced another plan, it wasn't clear how the action was supplementing the work described in the plan being referenced. Additionally, there were some calculations for expenditures that needed some corrections. And in the last section, the monitoring for all actions did not include all of the actions from the plan sections. So our communication with LEA contacts and including districts and charters will indicate the revisions that are needed. And those revisions will be submitted through the LCAP by January 7th. Next slide, please. And this slide provides another update, and this update relates to the LCAP portal. Our LCAP will release the LCAP system for developing the 22-23 LCAP by February. And this is our online portal where LEAs can develop their LCAP, and it will include revisions made to the LCAP template and rollover information for LEAs to use in developing their new LCAP. So that rollover information will be information from the prior year LCAP that the LEA can use to support developing the new LCAP. So within the system, it will provide a place for an upload of the PDF of the budget overview for parents as it has previously. Additionally, the one-time supplement template for the annual update to the 2021-22 LCAP will be uploaded to the LCAP. Will be the same PDF upload format as in the past for the budget overview for parents. And then the remaining sections for the new LCAP will be developed within the system, and all of this will be merged together for your 2022-23 LCAP. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bonnie for some additional reminders.
Okay, very quick reminders, and I'm already seeing panic in the ranks, Jeannie. Don't worry, folks, most of those things that need to be addressed are relatively minor and won't be a major revision out there. So breathe. This one, hopefully you've all done, but so it's just a reminder. We usually talk about comparability sometime in October, but the Title I comparability is required annually as a condition of receiving funds. You are no longer submitting it anywhere, but you do need to keep it on site for any kind of review. So you have to annually demonstrate that you are equitably providing funds and materials, staff to all of your sites. And the link there will take you to the CDE website, so you can go through all the information is there. It's far too long and not interesting to go through here, but I don't think you should have any questions. But on the next slide, you'll see what you should have in place are policies and procedures for maintaining comparability. And you should have procedures for how are you doing it, when do you do the comparability report. So if you're new to the district, you might check, or if you're new to your charter school, check your policies and procedures and say, when do we do? They'll say, you're so smart when you say that. Like, when do we do our comparability report, and how do we do that report? It should be in writing. And if you're reviewed, they will ask to see your procedures and your actual calculations. So just make sure you've done that. Usually it's in October or so, because it is early in the year, but sort of after things get settled with your students. So comparability, hopefully you've done that. If not, check that, a web link, and check your procedures to make sure you have them. Secondly is a reminder to be prepared for the Con App. It's due to be released. Haven't heard anything new about it. Still due to be released January 15th. That's the winter submission. That's for any of you charters or districts that are receiving any ESSA funds this year. It's due February 28th. You need to be registered in the centralized authenticating system at CARS, and you can go to the CD website, just check in Con App, and it'll take you there. You want to sign up for the listserv. Here's where you sign up to send a blank email to them, and they'll let you know when anything is released, and we'll also give you a heads up. We will be providing a workshop. Generally, we do that at the end of January or early in February when the system is released. You also should be alerting your program and fiscal staff who work with those programs, because especially the fiscal, the winter submission is a lot of fiscal information. So make sure they're ready for that and ready to support you with that. Okay, that's it. And we are 4 minutes over. We wish you the best of the holidays. You deserve so more than anyone. Everyone on this group deserves a rest. We will see you the end of January, if not before that. But take care and enjoy, and get the rest you deserve. We'll see you next year, 2022. Take care.